welcome to Trip the Beltway Fantastic. This week, the U.S. military buildup off the coast of Venezuela continued, with two B-1 bombers flying as close to land as any have come in previous flights, according to Air and Space Force magazine. This is a transparent show of force, as the B-1s did not turn off their transponders, wanting everyone, especially Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, to know exactly where they are. The bombers are capable of carrying cruise missiles and guided bombs that could be used in possible strikes on land and aren't the first that have buzzed the area in recent weeks. Now, they are certainly not the only assets in the region either. The USS Gerald Ford carrier group is on its way down to the region from the CENTCOM area of operations in the Middle East. It brings a host of weapon systems, not the least of which are F-35 and F-18 fighters, with a range of missile capabilities and accompanying destroyers that can fire Tomahawks, and a likely Virginia-class submarine also with the ability to launch Tomahawks. According to the Washington Post, the carrier will join an armada that has been assembled in the Caribbean. Other vessels there include the destroyers USS Jason Dunham, USS Gravely, USS Stockdale, the guided missile cruiser Lake Erie, and the littoral combat ship Wichita. The Navy and Marine Corps have also combined to deploy the Iwo Jima Amphibious Ready Group, a 3-ship task force that includes additional sailors and Marines off the coast of Venezuela. The Marines are with the 22nd Marine Expeditionary Unit of Camp Lejeune in North Carolina. That includes Harrier fighter jets, helicopters, and a battalion with hundreds of infantry Marines. The Pentagon in recent weeks has also deployed the MV Ocean Trader, a civilian ship converted into a floating special operations base that can dispatch troops on short notice. The ship's presence in the Caribbean coincided with the deployment of select aircraft from the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, an elite helicopter unit that supports the most dangerous missions in the world, according to the Washington Post. Visuals analyzed by the paper showed helicopters, including MH-6 Little Birds, that commanders favor for special operations ground assaults, flying less than 90 miles from Venezuela's coastline in early October. When the Gerald Ford arrives, there will be more than 10,000 U.S. military personnel in the region. Not enough for a proper invasion, but a growing footprint nonetheless, and no doubt troubling for Maduro and Venezuela's neighbors, who are now getting a sense of what Trump's effort to revitalize the neo-Monroe doctrine is shaping up to look like. Now, is this war, maximum pressure, regime change? Here to talk to us this week are two informed critics of the U.S. moves in the region, which also include U.S. military strikes on 12 now alleged narco boats in the Caribbean and Pacific, with at least 50 dead that we know of as of Tuesday. Jen Kavanaugh is a senior fellow and director of military analysis at Defense Priorities, and Dan DePetris is a syndicated foreign affairs columnist for the Chicago Tribune, a foreign affairs writer for Newsweek, and also a fellow at Defense Priorities. I know this sounds like the Defense Priorities show, but honestly, you guys have been doing really monumental work in this space. Criticizing and dissecting the Trump policy in the region. So I really appreciate you coming on to Trip the Beltway Fantastic today with me.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Kelly.
Absolutely. Thank you. So I wanted to ask each of you, what do you take away from the massive military buildup in the Caribbean? Are we going to war? I'll start with you, Jen.
Well, I will admit that for a long time, I tried to ignore what was happening in South America. It was just too much for my brain to handle, that I now had to, as someone who studies what the U.S. military does, learn about an entirely new theater after trying to keep up with Ukraine and what's happening with Iran and Israel and Gaza and Asia. Having to add another a conflict to my list was just very distressing. However, when, as the amount of military power started to increase and we passed 10% of U.S. naval power in the region, I just gave up and realized that like this was something to be paying attention to, especially after we saw the recent announcement on Friday that the carrier strike group was moving to the region. And for me, that is really the red flag. There's no reason to move a carrier strike group to the region unless you really plan to do something more than just put pressure on Maduro. You don't need a carrier strike group which comes with multiple warships, all of the personnel, the additional Tomahawks, and all the air power that comes on an aircraft carrier. You don't need that unless you're planning some kind of military operation. So now we have about, once the USS Gerald Ford arrives, we will have about as much naval power off the coast of Venezuela as we had in the Middle East for the Houthi campaign. And so my concern here really is that that's what we're gearing up for, is some sort of, not a ground invasion. As you said, the amount of forces in the region right now are not enough for any kind of major ground presence in the region, but that we're gearing up for some kind of extended campaign of air and naval strikes on Venezuela. And obviously we have multiple decades of U.S. history to look at of what these types of operations turn out to be. The objectives to me are unclear. Regime change is one piece. Maybe we can talk a little bit more about, what's motivating this, but like any intervention, there are lots of layers to this, what's happening in Latin America now, not just Venezuela, but also Colombia and elsewhere. The question, are we going to war? Something is going to happen, in my view. There's just no other way to explain the movement of the carrier strike group. And for me, that's the deciding factor.
Dan, do you agree?
Yeah, I would. I mean, it's a very concerning development in that, I wasn't necessarily surprised that Trump would use force against what he calls narco terrorists in the region. And I wasn't really surprised because he sort of telegraphed it during the campaign, where he made a the counter-narcotics file as a very big talking point, both during the campaign and immediately afterwards. I mean, I think it took about a week or two, maybe not even that much, for Trump to designate a long list of trafficking organizations in Latin America as foreign terrorist organizations. So that the fact that he's using force doesn't necessarily surprise me, but what does surprise me is the extent to which we have a lot of, as Jennifer just articulated, a lot of U.S. military assets in the region. We have now a carrier group coming in. We have 10 F-35s stationed in Puerto Rico. You don't need F-35s to bomb dinghies carrying drugs northward to the United States. So this is all concerning to me. Where this leads, whether it's a regime change operation or not, I can't tell you. I honestly don't think the administration knows whether they're going to go through a regime change operation. You have Marco Rubio, of course, who has been a longtime proponent of ousting Nicolas Maduro to his days as a senator. You have Rick Grenell, who's the special envoy to peace missions, who was actually going to Caracas during the beginning of the year and negotiating with Maduro over everything from energy contracts to immigration. So I think there's somewhat of a divide within the administration about what to do with Maduro long term. But obviously, if the last 5-6 weeks are any indication, I would say that the Rubio camp is certainly driving the policy right now, certainly more now than to the extent of 2 to 3 months ago.
I absolutely agree with you, Dan. Every indication is that Rubio is driving the policy inside the administration. There have been plenty of stories out there, including a really good one in the Miami Herald, where they talked about the amassing of power that Rubio has been successfully, doing all of the right things to maintain Trump's trust, to seat himself within the inner circle. They talked about how he was seated basically at every major foreign policy meeting with Susie Wiles and J.D. Vance, had the ear of the president. You saw how the president at the Knesset had called Rubio the greatest Secretary of State in American history, compared him to Kissinger. So he's really in a sweet spot right now in order to realize his long-held regime change dreams in the region. Jennifer, you had mentioned that when the carrier group movement was announced on Friday, you saw that as a red flag because there really isn't any reason to have a carrier group, strike group there if they weren't planning on some sort of attack. Can I just pose one question? Trump is so unpredictable. He and Hegseth brought every 4-star and admiral to heel in Virginia just a few weeks ago for basically a lecture and then let them go. I mean, they were willing to spend the money and basically rip everybody out of their area of operations in their commands just for a speech. Do you think there might be some chance he's willing to move all of these assets in the region just for a show of force because he can, and Hegseth thinks he can?
Well, I mean, sure. I think nothing is ever out of the realm of possibility. Certainly, looking over the history of U.S. military intervention, stranger things have happened. Every decision to intervene is very idiosyncratic. It's often made at the last minute based on a whole range of very situational factors. It's why it's so hard to predict U.S. military interventions. There are no really good set of predictive factors. I'll say a couple of things. The first is that if the goal here is regime change, maximum pressure, like putting lots of forces off the coast of Venezuela, is not going to drive Maduro from power. It hasn't worked yet. It's not going to work. Neither are airstrikes like on the territory. We saw just the effort to dislodge the Houthis with that strategy failed. So why would a regime that's very well entrenched, has significant support within it, the military surrounding Maduro, and the connections that military has throughout the other institutions of the state, it's not a well-functioning state maybe, but it's certainly entrenched. So I don't see this as a winning strategy. So if your goal here is regime change, it's not clear to me that anything short of some kind of ground operation, I'm not suggesting an invasion, but some kind of special forces or some kind of assassination, that's really to me the only option. And I don't know how far the administration is willing to go. But I'll also say that I actually think you brought up the speech, Hegseth's speech, Trump's speech, as something that seemed kind of pointless. But I actually think that those speeches are quite important for understanding what we're seeing in Venezuela. So I'll just point to a couple of things quickly. The first is, Hegseth talked about what he saw as his sort of ideal use of force as being the 1991 Gulf War, a very short, overwhelming use of U.S. military power against a very weak adversary. We're seeing the same sort of thing here. I think the administration sees this as a real opportunity to flex the U.S. military muscle. Now, part of the Gulf War, part of Panama, Grenada, these were things that happened after Vietnam, where the United States was trying to reassert its military dominance, to show that it could win wars, that it could do things successfully. This is another theme that came up, that Hegseth said that the era of Department of Defense is over. Now we have Department of War, and we're going to win wars. We haven't won a war since we had a Department of War. So here we are again, an opportunity to display U.S. military might, the administration might think, and show that the United States is, back, that it is able to assert its dominance. So this is an opportunity for that. Trump talked about using the military to fight the enemy within. Well, to the administration, the broader Western Hemisphere is an extension of the U.S. homeland. This is an extension of that war on the enemy within. The cartels, Maduro is a leftist. These are themes that keep coming up. So to me, those speeches, while there was a lot of fluff and a lot of things that were pointless, like the talk about beards and people being in shape, and there was a lot of fluff. But there were a few really, really important signals in those speeches that I think we actually see coming up again here, that these are recurring themes in how the administration is thinking about the use of military power that can help us to understand both what's happening now and what could happen.
I think that is so important. And that's why I have you on the show, because I hadn't thought of that. I mean, I think I thought of it subconsciously, like that he was sending a signal that these are the kinds of wars that we will permit, that we like. And the Persian Gulf example really turned me personally off because I felt like it was missing the forest for the trees in terms of our failed foreign policies that extended back to Vietnam. But that's a whole other show. But Dan, can you talk a little bit about that? I was around back then before the attacks on Saddam Hussein in 1991, well televised by CNN. But they spent a long time paving the way in the arena of public opinion to get the American people on board. I mean, we look back on it, and with some of the false stories and the propaganda that was generated in order to get that public opinion behind the war. Different dynamics too. People were concerned about being seen as anti-military after Vietnam. There was all sorts of social dynamics going on that led to the American people being on board with that particular war. They don't seem to be doing that heavy lifting today. So I doubt the guy walking down the street who's concerned about paying his bills and getting to work has really thought through the justifications for going to war with Venezuela. Do you agree? Do you agree that they haven't really explained this in a way that even Persian Gulf levels of support had been generated?
Yeah, I mean, I agree 100%. I'm glad you mentioned that because, the transparency that the administration has been, the basic transparency that the administration has been unwilling to even offer the American people or to members of Congress is just stunning to me. I mean, essentially what we're being led to believe is that the United States has 100% intelligence accuracy of what's happening along the coast of Venezuela. Defense Secretary Hegseth posts 10-second, 15-second clips of boats being blown up in the water, alleging that we've just destroyed a sack full of fentanyl that could kill 25,000 Americans if this boat landed on U.S. shores. He provides us no legal justification to what he's doing. The administration gives us no idea about who we're actually killing. We have no idea who we're killing. It sounds like some of these casualties could have been human smugglers or even people on boats trying to head northward. And of course, the whole issue of the legality of it all, and the fact that the administration hasn't even gone to the effort of justifying this in front of congressional committees or introducing an AUMF authorization for the use of military force, which even George W. Bush decided to do in the lead up to the Iraq War in 2003. So there's a lot of this I don't like. A lot of it revolves around process, but I think process is important. The Constitution says that we need to debate this stuff before we go to a war, particularly if it's a war in our own hemisphere that could have very long-lasting negative impacts on the U.S. homeland. And we're not doing that right now. We're essentially giving talking points to the American people and to members of Congress and hoping that they agree with them. And, there are some lawmakers, and I'll point out Tim Kaine is one of them, Rand Paul is another, who are adamant that they need more information and that not only they need more information, we need a vote on whether this is the appropriate policy. With the exception of those two who have, been longstanding proponents of Article 1 powers under the Constitution, Congress has essentially sat on its hands and played to the peanut gallery. So there's a lot of this that's very depressing from a constitutional standpoint. Not to even mention the foreign policy implications involved in just randomly bombing boats in the Southern Caribbean and hoping that drug flows magically stop and drug traffickers are magically deterred from making billions of dollars a year.
Yeah, I guess I don't think this is much about drugs, to be honest. I think that's sort of a distraction. I think it's the goals here, I think, are much bigger. And the bombing of the boats, I think, is a sort of like a hybrid war that's trying to put pressure on Maduro. This started with the maximum pressure campaign. And I think it's expanding. And I think there's a whole, I think the drugs are sort of a cover. All right. Trump said that that we're in a non-international armed conflict with the cartels. And, that suggests that it's not an international conflict, but it's not quite a domestic conflict. And so I guess they seem to be trying to build this case that they don't need to go to Congress for authorization for this, that this is part of this broader, quote unquote, war on drugs, when it's really about something bigger. Like that's the drugs are the surface, and then there's the regime change, there's the oil, there's the ideological sympathy between or lack of sympathy between Trump and Maduro, in contrast to some of the other leaders in the region. So to me, there's like all these layers, and the drugs is just kind of like this surface thing. So I guess that's distracting us from like the deeper things that we should be talking about.
But I think it's useful in getting the base on board with what Trump is doing. And so like I've seen that. I've gotten criticized within my own chats that I'm with people who are typically like fellow travelers on realism and restraint, have said, well, what are we going to do about these cartels? What are we going to do about the drugs that are killing our children? And so I do feel like this is an effort to placate the base, make them feel like Trump is doing something. He's tough. This is peace through strength. While Marco Rubio and others who have been, paving the way for this regime change for years, including the first Trump administration. I think we forget that that Trump had literally asked the Venezuelan military to turn on Maduro during that whole, Juan Guaido and the protests and the potential revolution and coup. Trump was very active. Mike Pompeo was very active. Rubio was seen as his right-hand man on Latin American affairs on Capitol Hill. So this isn't coming out of nowhere. I just think that the designs that they have to get this done are very focused on maintaining the MAGA base, which Trump had said, I am not for regime change wars. I am not for endless wars. I am not for spreading our military too thin. So now he has to find ways, like you mentioned, Jennifer, to justify these actions. And what better way than saying this is about protecting the homeland and protecting our children.
Right. And that's what I mean. That's what I mean, that it's an extension of this war on the enemy within. It's the foreign cartels that we are trying to fight inside, but now we have to go outside the United States to go to their roots. And as Dan, I think, laid out perfectly, like this is a losing strategy for going after cartels. It's a losing strategy for stopping drug flows into the United States. It's a losing strategy for regime change. So, to me, like it's concerning because this is just repeating with a different name, like a whole range of mistakes the U.S. has made in the past, right? It's repeating the global war on terror, this idea that we can like use strikes on boats, and the comparison of the cartels to Al-Qaeda. Like the cartels are nothing like Al-Qaeda. They're totally different. So we're trying to take this, GWAT narrative and paste it here when it was a failure the first time, but we're doing it again. And regime change, God knows how many times the United States has been involved in regime change operations, whether it's in Latin America or the Middle East, and none of these things work. Sorry, there's like a fighter jet like flying over my apartment repeatedly. I'm not really sure what's happening there. I guess that they don't like the podcast.
The wonders of living inside the Beltway.
Yeah, I don't know. Venezuela.
Yeah, I'm not really sure what's happening. It keeps going back and forth, which is really concerning to me. But anyway, I think it's very loud and distracting.
I know. And I mean, where are you, Jennifer?
Near Union Station. Can you hear it too?
I can hear something. Yeah.
Okay. So, and then the regime change, these things never work. I did like a whole bunch of work at RAND where we looked at when military interventions succeed and when they fail. And if you look at the regime change, they never achieve their objectives, even if we end up removing the leader that we sought to displace. The other outcomes are typically terrible. Very rarely is a new government set up. Often these states collapse into fighting. See Libya, see Iraq, see Afghanistan. The relations with the United States often don't improve. So this idea that we're going to replace the leader and then we're going to be friends, that often doesn't play out. And the costs to the populations in these countries are extremely high in terms of lost economic growth and other types of displacement. So the outcomes are just bad for everyone. And yet we're doing it again. And we've done it so many times and we know it doesn't work.
Dan, I'm going to posit something here because this has been kind of niggling at the back of my head, especially after, conversations with other MAGA types. So what if Trump is successful in removing Maduro without going to war, like a bloodless coup? He convinces him through maximum pressure. He gets to people in his inner circle in the military to push him out, have him exiled somewhere. He installs or helps to install Maria Machado, the opposition, as the new leadership in Venezuela. Do you see Trump, getting credit for replacing an evil dictator who has been keeping his country in poverty and rigging elections, and replacing him with a democracy that is going to work well with the West? Trump will promise them billions of dollars and bailouts and aid. They're opening up, the oil industry, and it's kumbaya. And that Trump takes credit for things. And I can see MAGA, which rushed to say, wow, what a great job he did when he bombed Iran and didn't pursue a regime change there and didn't pursue an endless war. And then it led 3 months later to the Gaza ceasefire. I see this narrative building. Can you talk a little bit about a bloodless coup and what the repercussions of that might be for U.S. foreign policy, but for the region?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, Kelly, I don't really see a bloodless coup as a high likely scenario. And the reason I say that is because the administration, as you mentioned before, during the first term, their whole maximum pressure strategy was predicated on the notion that they could split at least a portion of the senior Venezuelan military command from the Maduro regime, either through bribes or threats or promises of non-prosecution of their various crimes that they may have committed while they were in office. That didn't work, and the reason it didn't work, I would say, two reasons really. Number one is a lot of these people are totally wedded to Maduro's survival. The crimes that Maduro has committed inside Venezuela have been perpetrated in large part by paramilitary forces of the regime, and in some instances, the Venezuelan army. Um, you know, they are very hesitant to kind of throw overboard a guy in Maduro who has essentially given them all of the goodies and incentives that they could possibly ask for. And a lot of it is illicit. A lot of it is essentially looking the other way as criminal groups like the National Liberation Army do illegal gold mining, or use Venezuela as a transit point to send cocaine to Europe or even to the United States. So the notion that we could just sort of split the army from the regime strikes me as a very low probability. Number one, like I said, we've done this before. The fact that we are trying again, regardless of the history that I just mentioned, sort of boggles the mind. I mean, in one way, I would prefer that over using U.S. military force, but in another way, you know, even if it did succeed, there's a prospect of the Venezuelan army completely splitting apart as an institution. And then you have a whole new set of problems where, the stakeholders of the old regime have no incentive whatsoever to cooperate with the new regime. So I guess I would say, even if it was successful, it's not going to be successful, but even if it was successful, more problems would spring up, and we would have to ultimately deal with them, either through even a large scale U.S. military deployment, which I don't think anybody's interested in, or by enlisting countries in the region to essentially deal with the problem. And, Venezuela's neighbors are not going to be sending their own troops to Venezuela to keep the peace.
It sounds to me that Trump is really high on his own supply right now. No puns intended there. But I mean, after Iran and Gaza, and his taking credit for ending 8 wars that we can't figure out what he even means by that. But, he really feels like amassing this military firepower and the pressure that he feels that he can place on Maduro will send him running and fleeing. I agree with you, Dan. I don't think it's cut and dry. I don't think it's going to happen. But I can almost sense that Trump believes that in this peace through strength motto, that if he just brings every ship and every plane and every weapon to bear, that Maduro will have no choice but to leave. And I worry that it's just going to trigger something, because Maduro is not going to leave, and so they'll have to keep escalating to the next stage. And I think that's what Jennifer had her finger on. Like, something is going to happen. We just don't know what. And I hope it's not happening outside of our offices today, because ever since you mentioned that, this plane's been flying around here for the last 4 minutes.
I know, it keeps coming back, and now I saw a second one. I don't know. I don't know. Usually you can figure it out. We'll have to investigate what's happening here. Maybe
we'll have to investigate, and I'll put it in the show notes.
Fingers crossed it's an exercise or something like that.
Yes, another show of force.
I mean, so I do think, and I think, Kelly, you're right, though. Trump even said, I think it was last week, that the United States has the most powerful military in the world, and everyone's afraid of it. So this is, I think, this signaling here is not just for Venezuela. It's also, they think, a signal that to other countries that, like, the U.S. military isn't to be messed with. But I think an important question in my mind, and something to think about, is that this idea of this overwhelming force where the U.S. comes in and sort of crushes the adversary, right? This is the Gulf War model. This is what happened. Well, with Iran, we could debate, but it was sort of a spectacular show of force with very few casualties. I think that's what the administration is hoping will happen here. This model is not one that's really useful if we think about near-peer conflict. Like, this is not a model that's useful for wars that we expect to be protracted. This is not a model you could use in a conflict over Taiwan, for example. Like, this doesn't apply. You can't overmatch China's military capabilities in the same way. So my question is, is the focus here, the Hegseth speech and what we're seeing in Venezuela, like a signal that this is how the Trump administration is going to use military power? They're not interested. They're going to avoid protracted wars? Because that would actually be maybe a silver lining here. Or is this they think that this is the approach for protracted wars, which is extremely dangerous, because if you think you can use this model against China, you're just pushing up to nuclear escalation, right? That's going to drive it up. So I don't know which the answer is. And so that's what I've been spending a lot of my time thinking about. Is it this or is it this? And I don't think we have enough data to know, but it's something to watch.
Absolutely. Dan, you have any closing remarks?
Well, I mean, I guess I would just say that the administration, talking about silver linings, it doesn't seem that the administration, at least in my opinion, has made a concrete decision yet about whether to actually go through with a regime change operation. So that gives me some sort of hope that others within the interagency might be able to make a case in front of Trump, who, let's be honest, likes to change his mind a lot. What he says now could be completely different a week or two later. So, I mean, that in many ways, that's a good thing, because it allows people like us who believe that, a heavy-handed war on the cheap in Caracas is unviable and unwinnable, with greater costs and benefits. It provides people like us an opportunity to kind of make the case that, diplomacy is far preferable, if you want to get concessions out of Maduro, than threatening him by pointing a gun at his head, which virtually guarantees that he's not going to leave.
Right.
So, it gives us some degree of operating space there. But again, this is Trump. I don't know what he's ultimately going to do, so it's all supposition on my part.
Well, keep writing, keep getting on podcasts. You guys are excellent. And I am grateful that, unlike 4 years ago or 24 years ago, there is a media landscape in which critics like us and people like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Tucker Carlson are out there hammering away at this every day. So we'll just, keep shouting from the treetops. And and hopefully we'll get back. All three of us. Maybe we'll talk more as these developments roll out. And I appreciate you both taking the time to talk with me on Trip the Beltway. Fantastic.
Thank you, Kelly. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Kelly.